Good afternoon and welcome to the restart of the series Challenges in Forest Ecology. Bit of a glitch of you with the opening screen, but never mind. That's the way it is. So all things start with a glitch. So today's speaker is Professor Martin Lukac from University of Reading. He did a PhD in Bangor with some really famous person, working on the effects of elevated CO2 mainly. Martin has since moved and successfully established a career at Reading, where he's working more on soil sustainability and regenerative agriculture. And of course, agroforestry is a part of this. Martin, in his young age, we only have stars in this series, has got an H factor of 40, and his work's been cited over 7,000 times. So he is just a bit more than 35 though these days. Yeah, so thank you for coming. Look forward to an interesting seminar. And Martin, it's your camera, as it were.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. Just to check, can you hear me okay? Lovely. So yeah, all things starts with a glitch. You shouldn't have said that. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to present a seminar in this esteemed series. Speaking of the invitation, I can show you how does that look like. This is a screenshot from my phone. So as you can see, a very famous organizer has invited me because Fanny was giving a talk today. And then it turned to Fancy Fanny, and then I need to speak to the global audience. So Fancy Fanny will talk about agroforestry to the entire world is the summary of my presentation. So this will be fun. I'll try and keep it as engaging as I possibly can, even though it's an online seminar. So, right, so the outline is I'll do the presentation in 6 questions. I'll give a brief intro. What is this land sharing, land sparing thing? I'll talk about why agroforestry might fit the bill. Why do we need to talk about biodiversity? And then what do we know about these systems and how do they work? And finally, what are the implications, the limitations? And I believe at the end there is a question and answer session. So the first bit, the land sharing, land sparing, just to frame it, there are about 8 billion people on the planet as we speak. Just about everybody eats maybe 3 times a day. The distribution of food isn't perfect. There are people who are malnourished and there are people who are obese, but we all need to eat in order to survive. So to satisfy the demand by 8 billion people, we have expanded our food production base across the terrestrial landscape. And in order to do that, we have, by and large, removed the trees. So the current estimate is that since the invention of agriculture, we have removed about half of the world's forests in order to grow food for ourselves. So if that was not bad enough, what we now have is the modern agriculture, which has access to very potent machines and even more potent chemicals. And what modern agriculture does is it purposefully removes biodiversity from the bit of the land where the food is grown. So what we have is a system where we install monocultures on purpose. So we reduce the biodiversity as much as possible. And then the question arises, how do we get this biodiversity back? Is there a way around this problem? And this is where the land sharing, land sparing debate comes in. So you may have come across it, just a very brief picture to illustrate the point. The land sharing part of the argument says that what we should do is to grow our food as before, but try and introduce wildlife and biodiversity into the farmland everywhere. We share the land with nature. And on the other side of the table there is the land sparing argument, which says that what we should do is focus on some high intensive, high yielding farmland, which is where the human food will come from. And then the land that we will not need to grow food, we can give it back to nature, and this will be the natural habitat. So that's these are the two basic, sometimes opposing sides of the argument. And then we come with agroforestry, which is farming with trees. So what if we then farm with trees in some way that we can still have the high yielding farmland in order to grow food for humans, but we do it in some clever way so that we can have natural habitat in the same space and at the same time, which is what agroforestry is trying to do. So I can give you an example of farming with trees. This maybe is not something you would have imagined. This is an olive plantation in central Spain. I just lifted the image of Google Earth. And what you can see is a landscape with trees, but with higher plant diversity of 1. Because apart from the olives, every single other plant life form has been painstakingly removed from the landscape. This is not cheap. This costs money and effort to do it, but this is the way we farm. Okay, so what we have is a tree-based farming, but zero biodiversity, zero plant biodiversity. So not like this. This is not what I mean when I say agroforestry. Because why should we talk about agroforestry and why this may be of interest here in the big debate? So what it is, agroforestry, this is not new. This is a medieval, probably even older land management form where people purposefully integrate woody vegetation with agriculture. So there is a huge variety of options. One can grow trees and crops in the same field. One can keep trees and animals in the same field, or even put all these three components together in a rotation. I will focus on temperate agroforestry in my talk, but bear in mind that there is the tropical agroforestry, which has even bigger variety of options and different ways of putting things together. So talking about temperate agroforestry, the thing that is of interest and the thing that is probably relevant for biodiversity is that as soon as I plant trees into an arable or landscape, or a landscape used for intensive grazing, I introduce a perennial feature into it. So instead of using the landscape on an annual basis or even shorter basis, where I plant a crop, I grow it to maturity, and then I remove it, and then I start the cycle again, what I have now is bits of the land are not disturbed because the trees are in the way. So what I have is a permanent feature which may act as a repository of biodiversity, which may act as a connecting feature in the landscape, because the trees would typically stay in place for decades. So this is why we may want to consider this kind of systems. I have a couple of examples just to, if you don't know what exactly I'm talking about. So this is an example of silvo arable system. This is an experiment in Bedford in the UK here. So small plantation just to see what it does. And this is a combination of wheat and poplars. The way this works is that the trees are planted in straight lines, as you can see, because this allows the machines to pass through the system the same as before. So what I have is an intensive strip of agriculture, which is the alleyway with wheat. And then I have a row of trees, which serves as the permanent anchoring of this system. As you can see, under the trees in this experimental system, there isn't any vegetation on the ground. This is managed just for the trees. In other combinations, you can have a flower strip, for example, or a pollinator strip under the trees. So this is an example of silvo arable system. And then what we can have, as I mentioned, is combinations of the same with animals. So this is a silvo pasture where, as you can see, we have some grazing animals which are grazing on the pasture the same as before, but what they also have is some shade and some food, extra fodder provided by the trees. So I have an integration of a productive feature of the landscape, the same as in the monoculture, but with trees. So what I now have is a system which starts to deliver several other benefits apart from just food for humans. So that was a quick intro into agroforestry. And then the next question, which I had initially, is why biodiversity? So just as an illustration, there is a million of papers like this. I just picked one. This is one of David Tillman's papers. He has spent about 50 years doing this kind of experiments. So what you can see is that in every single graph on the x-axis, this is the number of plant species put together. So 1 means they are grown as monoculture, 16 means they grow together as a 16 species mixture. And as you can see, every single indicator of soil function, apart from phosphorus, is positively related to plant biodiversity. So what we know, and this is an illustration of such an effect, what we know that if I have higher biodiversity in an ecosystem, it works better. It is able to fulfill many functions better than if I have the same kind of thing, but with reduced biodiversity. Okay, so what we know is that biodiversity works. It contributes to several different aspects of an ecosystem function, productivity being one of them, sustainability, stability, ability to fight against disturbance, resilience. Biodiversity feeds positively into all these aspects. So why biodiversity? Because we need it. So biodiversity and agroforestry, this is where I put the two concepts together and show you some examples of what we know about these systems. I'll start with the basic monoculture. So a standard agricultural field, what we have is the distinction between above ground and below ground, as in the bits we can see when we are looking at the field. This is the above ground part. This is the easily accessible and more measured part, or more experimented on part of the system. And then we have the below ground bit, which is the soil, where the soil organisms live and where the plant roots take the water and nutrients from. Bear in mind that the distinction between above ground and below ground is purely artificial. This is just for us to understand the system in a little easier manner. In fact, we're always talking about one system. It functions as one bit. So I have the plants. The biodiversity has been reduced to 1 typically in an arable field. And then maybe I have some pasture and some grazing animals. And this is how human food production operates on land. This is how we design these systems. And then in agroforestry, what I do is I introduce trees into the system. This complicates the system for the farmers. One of the reasons why this is not more prevalent, because all of a sudden I have an extra bit to manage, which is not easy. So I plant trees, and the first thing that happens is that there is a habitat which did not exist before. So if I look at the above ground part, just the very existence of trees in a field creates a habitat. There is a provision for species which did not exist before. The photosynthesis, for example, takes place in different levels in a system, where previously this was just at the ground level. Now I have photosynthesis distributed across the vertical axis of the system. There is shading, there is the change in wind speed, there is change in humidity, atmospheric humidity, for example, which all feeds into different kind of habitats, creating a different kind of habitats for species. And then if I look below ground, a similar thing happens. So where previously I only had the roots from the arable plants, or where I had the pasture, all of a sudden I have roots which reach deeper into the soil. They are able to exploit a bigger part of the soil profile. I have the provision of mycorrhizal species which colonize the tree roots, for example. I have more carbon coming into the soil via root exudates from the above ground part of the tree. So the system changes. There is more cycling of energy and nutrients in it, and there's a provision of different habitats. So that is the connection between agroforestry and biodiversity in its simplest form. And what I will do now is just to give you some examples of what we know. I picked maybe 5 or 6 papers. I aimed for review papers or for papers with more, which show data from more than one site, so they have a bit more evidence behind them. I'll start with birds. So we are starting at the top of the agroforestry system, and what you can see is what you would expect if I go from open agriculture, which is on the right, and I go to agroforestry, which is on the left. There is a very significant increase in the species richness of birds. This is kind of from the Institute of Bleeding Obvious. Like I said on the previous slide, if the birds need a habitat to nest, or if they need somewhere to perch, if there aren't no trees, they can't do this. As soon as I plant the trees and the canopy of the trees develops, there is a habitat for the trees to exploit, for the birds to exploit. And what you can see on this slide is the result of that. So compared to open agriculture, as in standard monocultures, agroforestry is much better for the birds. What we can also see on this slide is the comparison between the forest and agroforestry. And as you can see, there is no difference between the two. The graph shows slightly higher species richness in a forest, but the difference is not significant. So we should consider them more or less equal. Okay, so I still produce food from a piece of land in my agroforestry system. So the primary function of the parcel of land hasn't changed. But because I integrated trees into it, now for birds, my agroforestry system has a similar kind of value as a forest, speaking about species richness. So moving a little lower to the ground level, this is the work of Alexa Vara. She has done her PhD with us a couple of years back now. She was looking at pollinators, and the same kind of picture emerges. So if she measured, or rather she counted the pollinators in a control landscape, which was just open fields, and then in, I think, 3 or 4 agroforestry systems around the UK. What you can see is that for bumblebees, for solitary bees, hoverflies, and hoverflies, agroforestry is much better than monoculture. Okay, with the exception, and if you look at the top left graph here, with the exception of pasture. So in a pasture, it doesn't seem to matter for bumblebees if you introduce the trees or not. They seem to be equally unhappy in either of the systems. Okay, so agroforestry is much better for pollinators. And then if I look even lower, this is the ground dwelling insects which live on the soil surface, woodlice and millipedes in this example. What you can see is, what the graph is showing is a measurement of activity and density, so how many of these creatures are there, and their species richness as a function of the distance from the tree row. So the 0 line on the x-axis here is a measurement under the trees, and then if you walk into the alleyway, into the crop, 1, 5, 12, and I believe it was 20 meters, you can see a change in certainly species richness, but what you can also see is a decline in the activity and density of woodlice. But what is interesting here, and the reason why I blew up just the observation for woodlice, is the interaction with the crop. So as you can read from the graph, if I integrate trees and maize, sweet corn, this is an annual crop which is harvested in the autumn, late summer, autumn, which reduces the habitat. So I have a lot of woodlice under the trees, but they more or less disappear from the crop. On the other hand, if I combine trees and winter cereals, which stay upright throughout the winter, the effect is not as strong. So there is fewer woodlice in the alleyway, but they do not disappear entirely because they are still able to live within the crop. So I use 3 different kinds of animal species and their diversity to illustrate the point of how the trees help above ground. What I'll do now is switch to the soil. I have a similar kind of illustration, but this time for soil biodiversity, which is different in its nature, as in we typically tend to focus more on the microbiota in the soil rather than the higher organisms. So this is a result from, by the way, I put all the references to the papers in the slides, so I'm happy to share the presentation if you want to look up the papers where all this is from. This is a comparison of 3 different agroforestry experiments. So the logic is the same as in the previous graph. What you see in green is the measurement under the tree row and then increasing distance into the crop. And what you see in all 3 soils, 3 different soils, is similar kind of behavior, similar kind of message. The diversity, sorry, the bacterial abundance is the highest under the trees, and then it tends to decrease as you walk away from the tree line. Okay, this is bacterial abundance, so pay attention to the y-axis. This is a logarithmic scale, so the differences in actual bacterial abundance are much bigger than what you can perceive from the graph. Earthworms, similar kind of thing. What is interesting, or I think what is interesting, is to compare the previous graph, which is bacteria, with this one, because bacteria do not travel much through the soil. Earthworms, at least some of the species, they have a much better capacity to spread through the system and find better environment for them. So what we can see here is that the earthworms really prefer the tree row. This is where they find the best kind of habitat. These are the green bars. And what we see is if we walk away from the tree row 1, 7, and 18 meters into the crop, the density of earthworms decreases. And then what you can see also is on the right side of each graph is the monoculture cropland, which is kind of the reference for business as usual. So the take-home message from this slide is that if I have trees integrated into an arable landscape, this is much, much better for the earthworms. So in a normal business as usual arable landscape, what you would get is this very low observation of earthworm density. And then what also happens is that the tree row acts as the reservoir habitat. This is where the earthworms survive and propagate. And then some individuals venture into the crop. So they improve soil function under the crop, which and this improvement decreases as a function of distance because the earthworms cannot travel that far into the crop. And then finally, this is a nice paper. This is a review paper. So what these people have done, they put together maybe 130, 140 observations into a single database. So when we look at just the indicators focusing on soil biodiversity. Okay, so ignoring soil physics and ignoring soil chemistry on left and right. If we just look at the bits which is highlighted in red, these are the known effects of agroforestry on different types of soil organisms. Okay, going from the macrofauna on the left, earthworms and animal feeders, going to bacteria, fungi, and mycorrhizal fungi on the right. One important thing is that all the red circles, which signify the effect of agroforestry, they are all above zero, the zero line, which means this is all positive, which is good. This is what we want. This is why we would want to plant the trees in monoculture. The other thing which I think I need to highlight is the response ratio. This is on a logarithmic scale. So 1 doesn't mean 100%. 1 means 270% increase, which is for Collembola, for example, or Acari, this is a spectacular increase. And the other thing which I wanted to mention is the amount of not determined, as in we do not know how does this work, because nobody looked. So there is a lot of potential science to be done here on trying to figure out how does integration of trees into arable or pasture land impact on soil biodiversity. So if I try to summarize it, what does the evidence really say? Typically, we compare arable control, which is the landscape in the back, to the agroforestry, crop alleys, and tree rows, which are at the forefront. This kind of message emerges. So there are some studies which show that there is a negative effect on biodiversity, but by and large, what we see is a positive increase in the amount of species and their activity just because we integrated trees into an agricultural landscape. So a couple of review papers for you again. Just this is summarizing the current knowledge on the relationship between temperate agroforestry in Europe and biodiversity. So overall positive, some mixed results. It depends on what kind of system it is, what is the landscape context, how old the system is, and how is it managed. But by and large, what we know is that this works and the relationship is positive. And oh yes, and then last thing, what I didn't mention and what I think is important, especially in a forestry seminar series, is the tree biodiversity itself. So one doesn't plant just one species of trees. You can pick from many different options how to design the system. Two of my colleagues, Tom Statten and Tom Breeze in Reading here, they have put together a tree species guide for UK agroforestry. So what you can see is the typical species introduced into these systems. And then I just picked a common order at random. And what you can see in these information slides for each species is the value to wildlife also. So how does the species contribute to the wider biodiversity value of the system? So in summary, agroforestry is a form of land sharing. It integrates trees and wildlife habitat within the productive land at the same time, which I think is a positive move. Put into the wider context of the landscape, it could act as a bridge between sharing and sparing, so creates habitats which connects different parts of the landscape. By definition, it increases landscape heterogeneity because I have trees where previously I did not have them. And then by design, it supports multifunctionality. I still get food production for humans. This is where we started. But as we saw, this increases biodiversity, contributes to livelihoods of farmers, and so on and so forth. And then the last thing I left there, this is something where evidence is still missing. What we do not know is how does this work if everybody did agroforestry? Because that hasn't been tried, at least not in European context. So thank you. I am perfectly on time. Looking at my clock here, thank you for listening, and thank you to the many colleagues in the Sustainable Land Management Group in Reading, and thank you to the many contributors of the Reforest project, which is trying to increase the uptake of agroforestry in Europe. Over to you, Doug.
Now, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Very, very, very interesting. So what we normally do is we now have a chance to ask questions. We normally write the questions into the chat box because otherwise it gets a bit out of control. So but we could do it differently. If you want to ask the question, you're happy to ask the question. Come on, let's live dangerously. Yeah, so anybody have a question? First of all? No? If not, yes, maybe. Yeah. Jimmy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I think the facts are fairly clear as far as biodiversity is concerned. My question, I'm doing research on the human side of forestry, and I'm wondering if you've done any research on that as well, or when doing research, talking to farmers, what is their perception of that? What are the potential obstacles? What is their, let's say, traditional ecological knowledge that could be built on or mobilized as well to promote this?
So the simple answer to your question is yes. We have done this type of research extensively by now, I can say. The perception of the system is positive, I have to say, and it's getting more positive by the minute. So whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, I had to explain what agroforestry is and how exactly does it work, what we do get now when we talk to farmers is a question of, yes, I know what it is, but how do I actually do it? So I can see a shift in the understanding of these systems and the interest in them. And then what are the obstacles? Again, we have done quite a bit of research on this specific question. Why is this not more prevalent, and why are not farmers more engaging with this kind of food production? So the most common answers are it's difficult to set up, it costs money and time, and I do not have the money or time. So what I would need is some help from typically the government or somebody that is interested in perhaps carbon capture in these trees. The second most common answer perhaps is I do not know how to do it. I am a farmer, I know how to grow crops, I know how to tend to animals, but I do not do trees. So I need somebody to help me with the tree bit, which again, there are workarounds around that. Then come the market, as in how is this going to earn money for either me or for my children later, once I pass the farm over to the next generation. So the monetization of the benefits of trees, this is an important question. And yeah, I think that's it. Those were the main ones. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question. Somebody raised their hand. I just can't see. Now we get to how the system breaks down.
Jennifer, I believe. I can see it.
I can't see it. Jennifer, great. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks a lot for your excellent presentation. Very interesting. I'm wondering, as the landsharing concept is landscape-based, let's say, a look on things, and you rather showed the effects on biodiversity on a side scale. I was wondering if you have any knowledge of studies who also look at the, let's say, landscape heterogeneity or patterns around the landscape that influence the processes on the site. I mean, I assume by bacteria and local things don't do that, but do you think there's research on that going on somewhere?
I'm not aware of anybody doing this in a meaningful way. This is an important question. In Europe, there are two examples where agroforestry works at the landscape scale. One is the Heza Montado system in the Iberian Peninsula with oaks, and the other one is the reindeer farming in Scandinavia. The problem with these two is that they have kind of always been there, so it's difficult to run a counterfactual, as in what is the benefit of agroforestry at this scale for the landscape, because you cannot compare it with a control in any easy way. So there are studies on how does landscape heterogeneity at a larger scale benefit biodiversity, but I am not aware of any which would be picking out agroforestry specifically, which is unfortunate. And then I didn't say in the presentation, but one thing that is missing, I tried to find some papers on mammals, as in agroforestry and mammals and mammal biodiversity. There aren't many, and I think one of the reasons for this is that in a farming landscape, many of the mammals are perceived as pests. So there is a disincentive to, if you are trying to incentivize people to pick up agroforestry, to focus on bits which may be harmful to the farming enterprise.
Yes, okay, thanks. Very interesting. I mean, I was just wondering because the landscape scale could be quite interesting here. So.
It is, yes. I wish somebody, maybe you could do it.
Yeah, let's see. Thanks.
Yeah, you don't want to do anything that encourages wild pigs, I suppose. Something like that.
Yes, deer, foxes, it's all wildlife, biodiversity. But yeah, the connection with farming is a bit.
Okay, the next question is, at least on my screen to the left, is Hishik. Hishik, would you like to ask a question?
Okay, thank you very much. Martin, Lucas, that was a really interesting presentation for us, even including my students and my colleagues. We are participating in your webinar now, and I have a small question. So, such a country like Mongolia, arid and semi-arid zone, and if somebody wants to building of agroforestry, like a farm level, so is there any minimum area or tree lines length and so on? So actually, for the agroforestry, how much area it would be covered with these forest trees, lines, or bunch of trees and so on?
Okay.
So would you?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. There isn't any minimum area where one can try this. So there are experimental systems in the UK or around Europe where the farmer just wanted to try this because they were interested in just let's see what happens. And some of them are less than a hectare. So what the only thing you need to do is to take a piece of land where you were growing food in some shape or form or raising food, and introduce trees in this place, and then you can start experimenting in does this work? How does it work? Do I need to change the distance between the trees? Do I need to change the tree species, for example? So it just came to my mind, one of the smallest systems that I've seen is silver poultry, where egg-laying hens are integrated with trees because as species, chickens evolved in the undergrowth, and they get stressed in an open environment. So one of the best things you can do for them as a farmer is to introduce vegetation that they can hide underneath. This is very beneficial for their well-being. So in the UK, for example, Sainsbury's is one of the biggest supermarkets. They only stock eggs from these kind of systems now.
Thank you very much.
So the next person on the screen is Simon.
Yeah, thanks. Hi. So hi, Martin. I was wondering, because as I understand this debate about land sharing versus land sparing is that basically the argument for not considering land sharing is basically that if we share the lands, then we put more pressure on existing natural and semi-natural habitats, which is why let's intensify the agricultural land that we have and then just leave the rest for nature in some way. And if we basically just assume that we want to keep the current production, agricultural production, as high as it is, and we just assume that we need as much as we produce right now, then I wonder if the units that you showed to say, okay, in agroforestry, biodiversity, you showed basically it was again biodiversity per, I don't know, per area and whatnot.
Yes.
But maybe the better unit in that case would have been the biodiversity per unit food produced, for example, to show that agroforestry is actually not just another land sharing method, but some sort of a land sharing method that can also that does not additionally put pressure on existing natural areas.
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
I think this is worth a paper just to scale the biodiversity effects per, I don't know, calorific gain from the landscape.
right.
Yeah, this is a very good idea. Thank you. I am not aware of somebody having tried this.
Yeah,
We could
me
try.
neither. I was
It would
wondering
make
if
sense.
you-
Yeah. Yes, and then just on a wider point, this land sharing, land sparing. So the idea, or one of the drivers for the land sparing argument, is that we need to keep the same level of production or increase it. But what agroforestry tends to do is to produce very much the same kind of output from a unit land, especially if the trees that you introduce into the system are nuts or fruit trees. Then what you get is actually an increase in land equivalence ratio. So I think this is around 1.3, 1.4. So if you have an agroforestry system, you get the same level of overall production in the agroforestry as opposed to 1.4 hectares if you had monocultures.
Great. Okay. I'll just read a couple of questions. Boris Rewell just wrote to you. You can probably see it as well, but could you elaborate on the magnitude of paludiculture, landscape scale re-wetting, particularly of wetlands in the UK, Central Europe, and the flooding tolerance of common woody species?
The next seminar, please. Okay, I'll admit I cannot turn my head fast enough to answer this. What I can say, just start digging at it slowly, is that what tends to happen in a landscape with trees is the lowering of the water table. So if I'm talking about paludiculture, there is a strong element of competition between the productive bit, which needs water, and the tree bit, which tends to evaporate or utilize the water at a fairly good nick. So that's one bit. And then there was flooding tolerance. I suspect you can just go with the usual forestry classification of trees. So if you need to grow trees in an often flooded landscape, you would go with willows and poplars, and then perhaps alder in the temperate zone.
Wetland rice with alder. Sounds good.
Yes.
And then from Dastan, the question, do you have common tree species that you can recommend for the tropics for multifunctionality, such as soil, water production, foods, etc.?
Okay. Yes. So I did not go into this in the presentation because it would be too complicated. I work with a charity in Ecuador, and what we do is try to enhance the uptake of Inga agroforestry. Inga, I don't know where you are based, so this may not be relevant to you, depending on the restriction of on non-native species. So what we see is that if you introduce Inga trees into cocoa or coffee plantations, they provide the shade that your cash crop needs anyway, but they also fix nitrogen and speed up the nutrient cycle in the soil. So that's already beneficial. And then this is anecdotal. We haven't tried this tested this in a scientific way yet. What we see is that if you integrate Inga and cocoa, you get a severe reduction in the cocoa pod rot. There is some biological interaction where the Inga trees protect the cocoa pods from rotting.
Great. Okay. One more. Jasper Grond. In cases where agroforestry systems didn't show an increase in plant diversity compared to open fields, do we know whether these fields are managed with intensive chemical inputs, for example, herbicides or pesticides? I'm wondering if the lack of a biodiversity response might be more related to management intensity than the agroforestry structure itself.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. The answer, I think, is it always depends what do you start from, as in what is your business as usual control scenario. So the example of the agro silvo arable system that I had, which was just wheat and poplars, and the bit under the trees was sprayed to the ground because this is an experiment. So that's an example of a system where the plant diversity doesn't really benefit from the introduction of trees. You also start from a very low value. And then what we also see is that in some pastures, what happens is that the pasture, especially if it's not improved or not grazed intensively, the pasture itself is very diverse in terms of plant species. And then if you introduce trees into it, sometimes there is even a reduction because of shading by the trees. So I think the answer, I mean, I'm just repeating your question back. I think the answer is on the counterfactual. What is your control scenario? Where do you start from?
Okay, sorry, one more. It says a user, whoever a user is. Thank you for your presentation. Please, will you encourage agroforestry in a reclaimed land right after reclamation? I.e., would you use that?
Yes. Okay, just a generic answer, because this depends on the specific of the site. But I think it may be beneficial because the trees have the capacity to mop up pollution from the soil. And this typically works by association with mycorrhizal species, especially ectomycorrhizal, which tend to have a longer exploration hyphae. So I think this would work, where you would improve the quality of the soil by planting the trees. This is where whatever your pollutant, the reason for the reclamation is, the negative factor would accumulate in the trees, and then you can grow your crops or human food in the other part.
Great. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So I have a question myself, actually, which is, you talked about medieval agroforestry, saying this has been done for a long time, right? All of those agroforestry systems originally had a wood demand, i.e., the reason they had this system was because they were combining a system that produced firewood and a crop system. So isn't that sort of an aspect that could be considered, that actually we need a benefit from the trees, not just a biodiversity benefit, but actually a numerical economic benefit?
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yes, of course. I think it's a more potent argument for agroforestry than biodiversity. Farmers, one of the most common answers of why would you want to plant agroforestry in England by the farmers is, I want to improve the quality of the land and I would do it for the habitat, which is very nice, but it doesn't pay. So this is a nice aspiration, but then when it comes to actually looking at the system, the financial issues come out, and this is where the co-benefits of producing chips, wood chips, for example, you do not tend to get high quality timber from agroforestry as you would get from a commercial forest enterprise, because the trees have space to expand sideways and they do not grow upwards nice and straight. There are some niche enterprises. So just before the meeting, I was talking to a colleague of mine in Reading here. He has a small willow plantation by the Thames. And he planted it 8 years ago, and he said his agronomist came to have a look and said that next year they can harvest the willows for cricket bats. It's about £1,000 for each tree. Okay, so and as it happens, the demand for cricket willows, which are cricket bats, which are only made from willow, is driven by the increased popularity of one-day cricket. So all of a sudden you have a business opportunity which did not exist in the recent past. So yes, to answer your question, I think this is important in terms of running these systems as a commercial enterprise far more than biodiversity. And yes, it works. I mean, it goes to crazy adaptations, as in I produce the timber, I harvest it, then we turn it into biochar, in a retort, use the energy to power a turbine, and then put the biochar back into the soil under the trees to improve the soil in a nice closed system. So yeah, it's many adaptations of this.
Okay, great, Martin. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk and a very interesting question session. Okay, Elise, again, I thank you on behalf of all the people listening. Just to say for the seminar series that we return on the 5th of November with Francis Martin, who will talk about something about fungal biodiversity. So as it's the 5th of November, we're expecting some scientific fireworks, a British joke. Okay, so look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much all for coming. So
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.